Good evening all, and welcome back. Tonight we're going to be heading into the Haunted Woods, and I have a brand new sticker sheet for those of you who are interested. Sign up to my Patreon $10 tier, and you get this cool sticker sheet with a bunch of stickers. Graves, camping, the classic Mortis medium moon, Stairs in the Woods, one of my favourite, as well as Haunted Woods, Today, Stories by the Campfire, Cabins in the Woods, and more. And the first 15 of you who sign up on Patreon will actually get the old sticker sheet as well, because we have a bunch left over. This promotion is not going to last anywhere near as long as the last one. It's only going to be about until Sunday the 15th. That's just a little over a week. So if you want it, be sure to check out my Patreon to get it. Link in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My wife's Uncle Jack bought some land just north of Spokane, Washington, with a friend of the family, Kane. They got it at a significant discount because a nearby aluminium smelter had polluted the ground and it was impossible to use the water beneath it. They had set up 2 plots and each had a camper to live in. Jack had been progressively getting more paranoid and saying that people were stalking him and watching him in the trees. About 3 months into living there, a man wandered through the woods and had an interaction with Jack. One thing led to another, and Jack ended up being attacked by this man, who punched him and broke his jaw. Upon being arrested, the man said he was overcome with a desire to see if he could kill Jack with a single punch. Not 2 months later, Jack was murdered in his sleep on the couch in his camper. Kane found him and immediately ran as far away until he stopped to call the police. There was sufficient evidence of who did it, as they quickly caught the killer, who was a 19-year-old boy who said he simply wanted his bike, and beat him to death with a power tool that was lying on the floor nearby, completely bashing his brains in. Kane was completely terrified at the time to be there alone. He had moved in with a family member until 8 months later, where he ended up with nowhere else to go, and he had to return. In constant fear, he finally convinced my pregnant wife and I to come and stay with him. The second I turned off the highway onto the property, I was overcome with dread. There were at least 250 crows covering the dirt road up to the property. I didn't sleep whatsoever the first night. I stared into the forest, searching for the cause of my intense fear. The energy of this place was so uncomfortable, and I assumed it was simply just knowing Uncle Jack was killed here. Even the days were eerie. Never did I have a moment where I didn't feel watched. My wife always had a sense of fear, especially after dark. Things sort of normalized for a while, until one day Kane began puking and feeling very lightheaded all the time. I took him to the hospital and they said he was fine, probably flu. At this point it was the anniversary of Jack's murder. 3 days after the date of Jack's death, Kane came running out of his camper screaming he couldn't breathe, waking up my wife and we ran out to see what was wrong. Kane had gotten into his car and floored it, crashing into a nearby tree. I ran up and peered through the window to see the most intense and primal fear I've ever seen in someone's eyes. He was gasping and clutching his chest. Moments later, he breathed out one last time and he was dead. We gave him CPR for half an hour until EMTs arrived. On July 10th, 1 year and 3 days after moving there with Jack, they were both dead. Now it's only me and my wife alone on the property. Every moment living in fear and not understanding what had happened here. I don't know why we didn't leave right away. One day I came out to get fresh water from a drum that we kept on the water to smell the worst smell I'd ever smelt. The water container had a 1-inch opening on the top, and inside the water were bits and pieces of chipmunks, like spines and heads. They didn't fall in. Something had ripped them apart before putting them inside. The nights were getting worse and worse. I never saw anything, just always filled with unease and intense fear. I grew up in the deep mountains of North Idaho, with the nearest town being 30 miles away. Fear in the woods, even at night, is new for me, hearing crashing and footsteps every night. One night my wife and I return home, hearing crashing and footsteps every night. Well, one day, my wife and I come home and have the worst feeling I ever felt. Everything looked different. Although everything was right there where we left it, nothing seemed in place. Looking around, I see this orange, long-haired, mangled cat sitting on a stump. This cat's eyes were so intense, fiery, almost glowing, but not quite. We start hearing branches snapping, pine needles crunching, seemingly from every direction, and I'm staring at this cat, almost frozen. Suddenly, a voice breaks out, echoing throughout the forest. "Is someone there?" A little girl, I thought, but something was off. My wife yells back, "Hello, are you okay?" "Anybody?" The voice had changed. "Help me! Help me!" We yell back several times without response. "Someone help me!" And then the most intense, shrieking, evil-sounding voice of a woman. I'm filled with more intense fear than I can ever describe. But my wife, she is overcome with the need to find this person, and she starts to head off into the forest without a word. I grabbed her by the arm and tell her something isn't right. Why won't she respond to us? She tries to break free from me to go off alone. I tell her to get into the truck, and I grab the spotlight. We aren't going on foot. We roll down the window and shine my intensely light LED lights through the forest. We slowly creep down the road yelling back. As we get further down the road, the voice strikes out, "Please, won't anyone help?" The sounds are difficult to pin down in the woods, but this one was close. I hit the brakes and stop immediately. We shine the lights and yell back, searching, but there's no sign of anyone, when suddenly, the voice explodes into the cabin of the vehicle, as if they were standing right next to my window. It leaves my ears hurting and ringing, and I hit the gas and don't look back. I called the police when I hit the highway, and afterwards they said there was no one around. I picked up our stuff the next day, and my wife gave birth the following. We never stayed there again after the baby was born. What the hell could these things do? I never even believed in the paranormal before, but I don't know what else would have happened had we all have stayed. We had all then been tested later, while living there, to make sure there were no metal levels on either autopsy reports, and there weren't. It seems there was no poisoning to either body whatsoever. So the question remains, what the hell were in those woods? I went to the battlefield of Bull Run, Virginia, not too long ago, and had an experience I cannot explain. I'm a bit of a skeptic, and still am, but this experience was hard to rationalize. It was a dreary, rainy day, with a slight mist clinging to the ground. I had driven to the battlefield later in the day, and was the only person on the grounds, except for the occasional park ranger walking around the perimeter of the visitor center. The sky was grey and growing darker, and I was standing next to an old house at the top of a hill near the parking lot, which was not far from the visitor center. As I took in the panoramic view of the darkening battlefield, it began to grow colder. As I pulled my jacket in tighter, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I heard a man whisper, "Get down." I whipped around, expecting to see a park ranger behind me, but there was nothing. I snapped back around and looked towards the visitor center, thinking maybe a ranger was yelling out to me to get off the hill because the grounds were closing, but I saw no one. I began to get nervous, desperately searching the horizon for any sign of life. "Who was that?" I said to myself. "What was that?" I frantically looked around, and began to notice that the mist on the ground began to dance gently, as if someone or something were disturbing it, like an unseen man was walking away from me. The strange movements of the mist distracted me from my former nervousness, but I soon snapped back to reality when I heard an ungodly shriek from inside the locked house. It was definitely the voice of a woman. It started loud and shrill, but slowly tapered off into a low, guttural gargling. I don't think I've ever run so fast as I did after hearing that wail. I startled the park ranger at the desk when I yanked open the door to the visitor center and slammed it shut, panting and babbling like an insane person. When I finally gained my composure, I told the ranger what had occurred, and he tried to give me a convincing smile. He told me I must have been out in the cold too long and invited me to check out the informational film, small museum and gift shop. When I took him up on his offer to check out the gift shop, I couldn't get over the ranger's underlying fear. He appeared to be hiding something, but I understood he couldn't say anything that might frighten future visitors, so I let the matter go for the time being. But when I got home, I scoured the internet for any explanation for the terror that I experienced, and I found that an old woman died in that house, killed by a cannon aimed at Confederate sharpshooters near the house. Was it the ghost of a Confederate sharpshooter that warned me to get down? Was it the old woman's tortured spirit that let loose that blood-curdling shriek? I will never know, and in that thing's mind, the war does not appear to be over. This happened recently, and the feeling of dread is finally subsiding. You see, I was driving with my boyfriend to this little cemetery. I wanted to check it out while we waited for a friend of mine we're meeting to be done with work. I live in southwestern Pennsylvania, so there are many wooded areas. We were driving down this one road in a pretty populated rural area, and then we turned onto the road we had to drive down to get to the cemetery. Immediately, the pit in our stomach formed, so the only light for miles were our headlights. We were surrounded by a void of pitch black nothingness. As we crept down the road, that feeling of dread grew and grew until my boyfriend stopped the car altogether. His eyes were glued to something right ahead of us. I saw a small light coming towards us, which I thought could be very distant headlights. Thus, I interpreted his panic as one of, "oh crap, people," and went on saying that it isn't illegal, since he had expressed earlier his fear of running with the cops. My boyfriend started panicking more and was trying to figure out how to get out of there. We turned around and got out of there as fast as we could. He told me he had seen a decent-sized shadow, and the light that I thought were distant headlights were actually the reflection of something's eyes. Growing up in Appalachia, I'm not a fan of the woods. I don't know what we saw, but I know that whatever it was, the dread it instilled in us was palpable. My siblings and I live in the pretty rural countryside with only two neighbors, one to the front of our house and the other to the right side of it. To the left of our house, we have pretty dense wood. Neither of our neighbors have children. It was late spring/early summer, and we had decided to play hide and seek in the woods, as we would do pretty commonly. We had been going for a few rounds, and it was my younger brother's turn to seek, so me and my sister decided to hide together. We crossed the creek and hopped over logs until we found a pretty wide tree to hide behind. We waited a few seconds, and we heard my brother say, "Ready or not, here I come." I motioned her to stay quiet and get behind me to remain hidden. We sat there for minutes, while I peeked around the side of the tree to watch my brother. At this point, I'm locked into the game, and I'm not paying attention. My sister nudges me, and it caught me pretty off guard, so I look over, and she's pointing at one of the trees near the abandoned shack behind us. I looked to where she was pointing, and I see what appears to be a kid, anywhere between 10 to 13, peering around the tree looking towards us. The first thing I notice is that he was wearing a green and white striped shirt. I looked at his face, but saw nothing. His head was there, but he had no facial features like a blank canvas. Quickly I got up and pulled my sister along and ran back towards the house. My brother was still looking for us, so as we passed we just told him to run, and he did. We ran inside the house to tell our mum what we saw, and she brushed it off as our imagination, but we insisted that we saw it. To this day I don't know what it was, but my sister, who saw it first, is convinced that it had no face. I only saw it for a second, so thought perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, but I still wonder what it was and why it was just watching us. I was living in the woods on some state land for a while a few years ago, as I was out of options. I could hear cars approaching from this stop from a mile away, and there weren't more than a few houses within walking distance, so I usually knew when there were people around. Yet, near where I found an old cobblestone foundation, about 50 yards from my camp, every night I saw what appeared to be an oil lantern where a match would strike. Even in the wind, the lantern would light. Then the match would go out, and the lantern would bob forward for about 15 steps, and then the light would disappear. I'm not all about ghosts and stuff, but to this day, I have no way to explain what it was I saw. I'm a Nepalese guy living in Norway. A few years back, when I was 14 roughly, there was this trail between my neighborhood and the school I used to go to. It took about 10 minutes to get across it, covered full of tree branches and a deep valley you needed to climb with a little creek running through it. On this particular autumn day, the leaves were falling off the trees and the temperatures were starting to dip, about 8 degrees Celsius roughly. This was the occasion that I experienced a hyper uncomfortable feeling, like I was being watched by something. You don't know what I mean, unless you've ever been hunted or looked at with an intention like this. I had the feeling that I was being watched, observed, tracked, and me being the paranoid and curious kid I am, took a glance back to where it came from but saw nothing, so I kept walking. That's when I heard someone yell my name, "Sudeep," and I looked back, expecting one of the kids from my neighborhood that perhaps wanted to walk home with me. But when I turned around to see who was there was no one. Nothing was behind me. I stood there in the solitude of the woods and felt like a solid minute, but was probably more like 5 to 7 seconds before I bolted. I don't understand who could have been there. There weren't very many places to hide. Maybe a big rock, but even so, I would have heard or seen someone walk to get to that rock. It still baffles me to this day. Perhaps there's something in the woods that I disturbed, and maybe there's a reason our ancestors were always wary of them. This past Wednesday night, I decided that I was going to go over to my family cemetery to do some EVP and video work. Now I do this a lot at my family cemetery, and I get some good EVP activity there. Normally I stop about a mile down the road at an old, small country church. I do this to pray for protection, because my great-grandfather owned and preached there, as well as my great-uncle. But for some reason I didn't stop there. Instead, I went to another spot down the road from the cemetery. I pulled off the road into a drive on some vacant property that my aunt and uncle own. It's surrounded by thick, wooded hills and a creek right across the road. I backed into the driveway and parked with the lights on and motor running. I started my video recording and began explaining what I was doing this night. And as I'm talking, I am facing the creek. I took note that this was one of those nights where it was very dark, no moonlight or anything, and at one point, I thought I saw something pop up over the creek bank and ducked back down quickly. I really didn't pay it any mind and kept narrating my video, only to realize that it did it again. I noted mentally that it appeared to be a human head type of thing, either pale white or a whitish grey. I wasn't feeling scared or anything, but I did realize that the air felt heavier than before. I pressed onwards until it raised up the third time, and I stopped talking because I heard what I thought was a deep male voice, faint, but I heard it. Then in that moment, it hit me hard. That fight or flight feeling, that gut instinct for self-preservation. I then felt as if something dark or evil was approaching, and it meant serious business. I said out loud, "No, no, no. I gotta get out of here now, right now." It felt as if I was watching a pissed-off Kodiak grizzly running at me full bore to eat me alive. I threw the truck into drive and punched the gas, trying to get away from the area as quickly as possible. I began reciting the Lord's Prayer and praying out loud while demanding that whatever entity had gotten into the truck got out. There was a loud double thump directly behind my seat. I yelled very loudly to get out now. I was still praying when I cut the wheel and turned into the church lot. I then called out to my great-grandpa and great-uncle to help me remove whatever had climbed into the truck with me. Between pulling out of the driveway and pulling into the church, I was jumped twice. Each time was very strong and took my breath away. It felt as if every drop of adrenaline had dumped into my system. They felt like a strong panic attack, but much worse. I have been told that happens when the spirit that you have encountered is jumping into your body to give you a very serious warning. I've had it happen a few times at other places, but never that hard or strong. But after praying out loud for several minutes, the air felt much lighter, and the gut feeling subsided. I started reviewing my video and audio, and found, just as I said no, 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 there's a faint male voice that says, "Attack him." And that it did. Now, the creek across from where I was parked has a dark history. My mum and my dad, as well as their brothers and sisters, were all raised right there in the area. There's a deep hole there, and they would go there and swim there as kids. One of my uncles had a best friend that drowned in that hole back in the 1960s. My uncle also drowned there in the early 1970s, but was revived. It was also the site of a fatal car accident where a young male that was getting ready to leave for Vietnam lost control of his '57 Chevy, and the car ended on the far bank and caught fire. The car was never pulled out, and some of it is here today. My grandmothers both told me for as long as I can remember to stay out of that hole unless I wanted to die. I don't know what I encountered the other night, but it definitely was upset that I was there, and felt evil, to say the least. The following events would occur over a year-long period, sometime in my mid-20s. My friends and I are avid gamers, and even still do our best to meet for some Dungeons and Dragons or something similar. Around our lower 20s, most of us lived in small apartments, or even still at home, and did not have so much space to play. So that was why we took to claiming a table at our local coffee shop. It was a good time, and we often would game far into the early morning hours. One such night we wrapped up what was planned earlier than expected, and none of us were ready to go home and sleep, when I heard one of our friends called Sean say, "I have an idea. Hop in my car, we're going for a ride." Excited, bored, and curious, and having downed a pot of coffee over the last few hours, I decidedly hopped in, and we were off. It did not take long for me to guess where we were going, though I was confused as to why. It was a dirt road surrounded by swamp and woodland, with a gorgeous stream running underneath that I used to take to my job. Now, we were prone to night walking, so I assumed that was the plan. However, as we approached the road, the other one with me, called Lisa, asked in a bit more concerned and curious voice, We aren't gonna Hatchet Man Road, are we?" I raised an eyebrow at the urban legend feel of all of this and stayed quiet, half expecting some sort of prank, as the two of them knew I was not 100% brave when doing things in the dark, no doubt because of my previous experience with whatever it was that occupied our house when I was younger, but I digress. We reached the road and turned on. Then Sean stopped the car and said, "Watch this." I sat in the back seat still confused and waited, at which point he took both feet off the pedals, put it in neutral, and the car began to move by itself. I do understand that vehicles can idle at low speeds, but even still, the car began moving. From my position in the center seat of the back row, I could see his feet were most definitely not on the gas, but the car began to accelerate from a complete stop and reached 30 miles an hour, which is a very significant speed to idle. The strangest part was that the road was flat, and no hills exist to even assist in the acceleration rate. The other odd thing is as soon as we get to the bridge over the creek, the car just stops. I am feeling a little concerned at this point, but we all simultaneously utter, "What the hell just happened?" Sean then puts the car into drive and continues down the road. As we drive, I look out the window and noticed how dark the edges of the woods are, save for two random tracks. Not too long after we began moving again, we saw some headlights pop up further down the road from behind us, only to disappear. Sure, the vehicle could have pulled into one of the two track paths or even turned around, but we would not see the lights or even signs of a car for the rest of our drive. Once we reached the end of the road, we turned around and headed back down for one final look, and the deck used to attach the CD Walkman flew out of the console tape player and nearly made it to the back seat. The turn was not a fast or sharp one by any means. It was like the deck was flung up by the cord or something. In any case, we did not make the last drive an extensive one and got the hell out of there. But that was not our last time there. It was just the beginning of a series of poor choices to visit that road. Fast forward a few weeks later, and we once again reached a point in our game where nothing else was prepared, and all had the wonderful idea of going to that famous road again. But this time we were walking. To add to the ridiculousness of it all, for whatever reason, we all had the wonderful idea of arming ourselves with various Ren Fair attire and wall hanger swords, as that was another of our unifying hobbies. So here we are, about to take a walk down a haunted, creepy road in full chainmail and swords. There are 2 carloads of us, maybe 8 to 10 total, heading down the road. We park at the creek and start walking, and almost immediately things got creepy. It started with distant moaning and screeching sounds that seemed to be forming all around us. As we walked further, I started to feel increasingly like we shouldn't be there. I then began to see occasional, creepy goblin-like silhouettes peeking out from behind trees just off the road. They were chest height, with pointed ears, and seemingly did nothing more than to watch. It was shortly after this that we began to see random flashes, orange to red in color, and about the size of a basketball, flash nearby and far back into the surrounding woods. Then suddenly, a transformer from the power lines running through the road erupts into a blast of electricity, as if it was blown. So we all jump, but still we continue down the road. The moans and screams got louder, and I start to feel like I needed to look to my left, and did so out of curiosity. Several yards down the road on the opposite side, I saw a white, mist-like apparition appear and float for a long moment. I got the sense of a feminine energy, but before I could concentrate long enough to make out any real detail, it was gone. I asked the group, if anyone else had seen it, to which they all replied that they had, and to keep going, so we did. A few more yards down the road, she would reappear, more distant and away for a shorter time. At this point, the loudest of screams echoed through the area, but was distinctly closer to us, and then we noped the hell back to our cars. As we drove away, we compared notes and pretty much had the same story. The exception being a friend who claimed to may have seen a mangled-looking woman crawl across the road looking over her shoulder, as if chased by someone else, then disappeared, and that the experience corresponded with the loudest of screams. That was our last group trip there. Eventually, I did take other friends down the road, but absolutely stayed in the car. I did see the white apparition again on that drive, this time further back in the woods and closer to the stream. I chose not to let people know what I saw, to see if they had similar experiences, and they did. And that was pretty much the last time down that road. Years later, I would mention these experiences to my nephew, and he would visit that road, even go as far as to go into the woods themselves, and say they found a cemetery. More reason not to go there again. It was so creepy. Incidentally, I would eventually ask why they called that place Hatchet Man Road, and the story is very much possessing of the typical urban legend, and goes that during the Cold War in the 80s, a family built a bunker in the woods somewhere, and the patriarch went crazy with cabin fever, killing his family with a hatchet, and then taking his own life. I never correlated the facts. Regardless, there is definitely something not quite right with the area. Many years after this misadventure, in my late 20s, a new era of strangeness occurred. It began with learning of a large, yet well-hidden nature preserve near where I lived. Now, I have always been in love with the wilderness and outdoors, and I had started regularly backpacking by this time, so when learning about a huge preserve so close, I had to check it out. And it was quite pleasant. Having such a substantial chunk of land in a city can make the imagination run wild with whatever horrible and unknown things could happen in such an ungoverned part of town, and there was plenty of evidence of sketchy things that may have occurred. Things I won't go into here, though it is worth noting that I did find an overlook deck off to the side of the main walking path to have pentagram graffiti with part of the rail with signs of a melted candle, as that location comes into play in a little bit. One night, myself and a couple of friends decided to take a trek into the preserve, though it was going to be dark before we knew it. Regardless, we headed in and had a relaxing hike, but found ourselves in the middle of the preserve running out of daylight. It was no big deal, as I had spent a lot of time hiking it and knew how to get around, but we had to decide on what path to take back home. The way we came, which was mostly a large, gridded walkway around the outskirts of the forest, or back into a wood-covered path that skirted around a swampy area. Though it was still somewhat lit, that part of the woods seemed to be darker than it should, but nevertheless, we of course chose that route. Initially, the walk was fine, though at the time I had a comical paranoia of snakes, and every stick on the path I swear was a snake. Humor aside, after we rounded the main pathway through that part of the woods, which wrapped around and back to the main walking path, things started getting strange. We noticed that the sounds in the area were muffled at best, which would have been due to the tree cover and hills throughout the preserve. But the silence included normal night critter sounds. It was eerie silent. At that point, we noticed red and orange flashes of light about the size of a basketball that would periodically flash off the main path or up ahead of us as we hiked on. From me, that was all I encountered, the flashes of lights, and a deep sense of terror, having encountered these sorts of things before. The other strange thing was a red tinge that enveloped the area and seemed to deepen. I have learned to be skeptical but open-minded, given the many stories of unexplainable strangeness, and the red color could have just been light pollution from the surrounding city, heightened by our own paranoia. Hard to say. Regardless, we continued our walk, hastening our steps to get us out of there as quickly as possible, and eventually, We made it out. After leaving the preserve, and before we got into the car, we plopped down and breathed, laughing as we tried to assess what the hell we just went through. One of my friends kept looking back into the woods, and often would stare off the path as we made our way out. Finally, looking concerned, he turned to us and asked if we had ever seen a hobgoblin-looking thing that kept following us. We both said no, but he continued to say that what he saw was mostly silhouettes, aside from glowing eye slits that were easily 7 or 8 feet tall and jacked with muscle. I was very glad that I had missed it. We would hike to the preserve many times after that, though not often in the night, and nothing like what happened out there again. Shortly thereafter, I moved in with a new roommate, and the two of us had begun to bond over our creepy stories. At this point in my life, I had also begun a bit of spiritual curiosity, finally coming to terms with the unexplained strangeness I'd encountered. Another friend at the time was very spiritual and believed strongly in spirit guides. He always liked to tell me that someone really wants to talk to me, referring to an apparent guide of mine, but I wasn't really comfortable with that aspect of the weirdness at first, and the idea of something or someone wanting to talk to me honestly freaked me out. Eventually I opted to give it a go, and through a guided meditation finally found myself delving in. My friend would ask things like, "Where are you? What do you see?" and ask if anyone else was present in my vision. As I worked through it, at first I saw a personal point of view, with me walking down an endless path through some woods, very peaceful. I kept getting minor flashes of another entity with me, but I couldn't keep the image for long before it disappeared. My friend suggested imagining myself asking for guidance, as he clearly felt this other was the guide. So I did, and finally I saw a figure appearing walking along me by a path, his back towards me as he walked. It appeared male, wearing a black t-shirt and jeans, well built with short dark hair, like a slightly more buff version of myself. I did not get a chance to connect or interact with whatever it was before he turned back to look at me over his left shoulder, immediately followed by a red flash which jolted me out of my vision. The red flash in junction with the spirit meant danger. My friend didn't have much to say, but he patiently smiled and said perhaps next time. There is still someone here that wants to speak to me, apparently. I was a bit freaked out and headed outside for some air, as well as to relieve my bladder, as he had lost power earlier that day due to a storm. I sighed and took care of business, looking down at his long kind of driveway, across the road and into a field some yards away, and then froze, as if standing there was a flash of a featureless red glowing torso, obscured by mist, turned towards me. I got the sensation that even though it was quite some distance away, it was looking straight at me with its featureless face, as if it, whatever it was, knew I was there. I didn't put it together until now, but it was oriented in the exact same way as my vision. The next day after I left my friend and headed home, I was talking to my new roommate about my experience the night before, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of orange light appear over my shoulder and close to the ceiling of the room. Not only that, but I felt a blast of static electricity as the ball appeared then faded, and it was obvious my roommate saw it too. We just shrugged, finished talking, and then got up for our bio break. After I returned, he looked at me with a smirk and said, "It's funny that we were talking about your spirit guides, because when you got up, your shadow waited a few seconds before it followed you." I had no more response. More strangeness followed me. At this point, I had not moved in, but was staying there since we would be about anything for all hours of the night, and it seemed to make most sense. The first night that I stayed there, my friend warned me that his cat likes to make his rounds through the condo, and his old roommate left the door a crack open so that he could do so. I didn't see a problem with that, he was a great cat, so I did the same when I turned in for the night. Shortly after setting into the camping cot that was serving as my bed, I heard the door slowly creak open. Expecting to see my roommate's cat, I was not so lucky. What I did see, however, was a solid white silhouette of a figure peeking around the door as if to check on me. Then it slowly withdrew from the door and disappeared. I've never felt as if I were in danger at all, but the idea of it still creeps me out to this day. I lived in that condo for quite a while, and though there wasn't another experience exactly like it, strange things always happened there. At one point I was home alone, playing a game upstairs, when I heard the voice of one of my friends ask my name upstairs, only to find out no one was there when I investigated. Another time while home alone, I heard what sounded like a piece of silverware falling to the floor or counter and immediately felt chills. When I got up to check it out, every single cupboard and drawer was open. It was just another day for me at that point. And that's the end. I haven't had any weirdness or strangeness since. I lived in a forested part of a coal mining town where my grandfather built a log cabin. As a teenager, I didn't sleep much for whatever reason. Because of that, I would go for walks at night. Nothing too strange ever happened except for an occasional whistling noise that I would only hear during my walks. Not when I'm sitting on the deck or wandering in the yard. I'm not sure if this is even related to the following event. But one night, I was talking with my grandfather in his office about that unfamiliar sound he usually always had an answer for, but not this time. We joked about its possible origins, and then I said goodnight. My phone had been dead for a few hours at this point, but midway down the stairs, it turned on and started playing Walking After Midnight by Patsy Cline, but only the I'm always walking after midnight searching for you part before shutting off again. My phone had been dead for at least 2 hours at this point, and that was not the last song I'd heard to. I'd tried turning it back on to see if perhaps I was mistaken and it hadn't died, but it flashed the dead battery symbol for a moment before going black again. Then my grandfather, whose office is only a few feet from the steps, calls out another fun fact. Patsy Cline died in a plane crash on my birthday. Obviously, I didn't go for a walk that night, or until I got a dog. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. So, the next 15 of you who sign up will actually get the old sticker sheet too, so be sure to do so, and this new sticker sheet. I really hope that you like it. We spent a lot of time making it, so yeah, I hope it's something fun, just something for you to stick wherever you want, really. And you get to join my Patreon, which gives you a whole bunch of cool features too, like exclusive stories and early polls and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. It's all listed there if you're interested. There's even some free stuff if you want to just look up Patreon now, just to see what there is available and what there is more of, really. A huge thanks to my existing members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. It really means a hell of a lot to me and more than you can ever know. And if you would like to see more content, links on screen now. But until next time, thanks for watching and stay awesome.